This is a download from BFM 89.9, the business station.
Good afternoon. You are listening to The Bigger Picture with me, Lee Chui Lin. For decades now, conventional wisdom has strongly suggested that staying away from saturated fats such as butter would be good for our health. This extends to one of our beloved national dishes, nasi lemak, and its corresponding delicious friend, rendang. But now new research suggests that saturated fats may have been unfairly vilified. Telling me more today is Professor Philippe Legrand, nutritional biochemist. So to start us off, perhaps you could tell us what a nutritional biochemist does.
Nutritional biochemist does fundamental research at the molecular level on nutrients. So the functions and the well-balance between benefits and risk.
Okay, so on a day-to-day basis, are you in a lab? What do you do? What is a day in the life?
I do this job since for little more than 30 years, and in my lab we are 15, and some are directly in the lab. Me less now because I am the boss, and we do research on cell culture, on animals, and also associated to clinical trials, but linked to the molecules before considering foods, and then nutritional guidelines on foods is a consequence, because usually we find all the molecules everywhere but just in different proportions.
On that note, while we're talking about guidelines, I understand that you also do quite a lot of work in that respect. Could you tell us more about that?
Yes, I chaired in 2001 and 2010 the guidelines in France. That means a panel of 14 specialists in lipids, and the guidelines for fatty acids established as what to eat for the general population, safe population, and primary prevention. But then, if they are ill, the guidelines are not false, but they fall to medicine guidelines.
Right. This is more for the general healthy population.
Yes.
Okay. Before we get down to, all the stuff about saturated fats, I understand that you also have an interesting hobby.
Yes, I am the conductor of the University Symphony in France, in Brittany, in my town.
Right. Yes. So you do a lot of research and conducting.
Yes.
Okay. So let's get down to this. Are all fats made equal? Because fat as a term has started to get a really negative connotation in general.
Yes, so that's completely false. Fat shouldn't have any negative consideration, because first of all, some fats are essential nutriments, and they have been called vitamin F in the history, and that's what we call essential fatty acids. It's like essential amino acids, for instance, or vitamins. But this is not the case of saturates. So the essential fatty acids are omega-3, for instance, famous.
And we've heard a lot about unsaturated and saturated fats. Could you tell us what are the key differences?
The key difference is structure. So maybe it's not worthy to explain it, but double bonds, so that's chemical differences. But to make simple, polyunsaturated fats are required to build membranes and cells, and saturated fats are more useful to do fuel. And that's quite a way to simplify. But we need fat for fuel anyway.
I think a lot of people think that we need carbohydrates for fuel. What's the difference between getting our fuel from carbohydrates as opposed to fat?
We need both of them, because carbohydrates as fuel is just for short term. For instance, in sport, that just ensures the 20 to first minutes, and then we switch to to fat. And it's important to know that for millions of years, fat is the best fuel, because it's the most concentrated form of the energy, 9 kilocalories per gram, as compared to carbohydrates, which is only 4 kilocalories per gram. And moreover, to store carbohydrates, we need water and space. And so the phenol ratio is 6 times the weight and space to store carbohydrates. So storing energy in the form of fat is just a change of the evolution since millions of years.
Are all saturated fats healthy then? Because we've been told, for years and years, decades and decades, that saturated fats are to blame for a multitude of illnesses, especially cardiovascular illnesses.
Yeah. So we make ourselves saturated fats from the excess of sugar we cannot store. So anyway, if somebody say, I don't want to eat saturated fat, he will synthesize a lot of them from the excess of carbohydrate, because you know probably that low fat is not a good diet, because low fat means high carbohydrate. The question is, like usual, where is the balance between fat and carbohydrates in terms of energy, for instance? And so saturated fat, we make them and we eat them. And in terms of functions, all saturates have interesting functions, and that's completely well established in terms of biochemical aspect, in terms of physiological aspect. But in case of excess, and it's just in case of excess, 3 of them are deleterious in terms of cardiovascular disease. That's C12, C14, and C16, which is called palmitic acid. But they are not the bad guys. We are the ones who consume them in too much amount.
Is there an issue in terms of processing as well, as in how much an oil has been processed before it reaches our tables to use?
I am not a specialist of this technology. No, they are not changed by processing. One of the key limits of processing is when you use unsaturated fats into margarines or shortenings and to saturate them. And that's a long story of trans fatty acid generated during this kind of processes. But if they are saturated and if we need them in the industry as saturated fats, they don't move at all. So we just fear the excess of some of them.
And can you tell us more about trans fats? Because that's something else that we hear a lot about.
Yes. Trans fat originate in the industry process to make concrete solid lipids who are usually liquid in the nature, and these trans fat have been demonstrated deleterious in terms of cardiovascular disease, and for 10 years they are now in Europe and Western countries removed from direct consumption in terms of margarines and so some we find still. But for us, in terms of nutrition, it's a finished problem, a solved issue.
Could you tell us what are some examples of saturated fats? Because we're talking chemicals and it can be something that's kind of difficult to understand. So butter, for example, is a saturated fat.
Yes. Okay. Saturated fats are originating in both animals and vegetables. For instance, in vegetable, palm oil is one source. It's not the best because in palm oil we find palmitic acid, which is the one we would like to diminish the consumption since we synthesize it himself. And coconut oil, maybe we will speak further, is a more interesting source of saturated fat, but in animals we find also a lot of saturated fat, and the less interesting is lard or something like that. So dairy products are, in terms of saturation only, are the most interesting, like coconut. We have a certain proximity between dairy saturated and coconut, and the other sources in animals and in plants are less interesting.
I understand that this isn't exactly your area, but coconut oil is something that a lot of people are talking about, especially on the internet, and recommending, to take in different amounts. What's your take on that briefly?
Among sources of saturated fats, coconut oil appears as the best sources in the vegetables, like dairy in the animals. That means the profile of saturates is quite rich. That means short and middle chain fatty acids in dairy products, and middle chain, very rich in middle chain for coconut oils. And these short and middle chain have no problem with cardiovascular disease at all. And okay, the second richness of coconut is the fact that in the group of the deleterious ones, in case of excess, C12, C14, and C16, as palm oil is too rich in C16, coconut oil is rich in C12. That's lauric acid. And in this group of 3, up-to-date data shows that lauric acid is probably much better than palmitic acid in terms of cardiovascular risk. That means lauric acid, it elevates, like other saturates, total cholesterol, but it decreases the most modern ratio in terms of prevention, which is total cholesterol divided